Well, here we are in Ballyhalbert, on the roof of the former control tower of RAF Ballyhalbert, also known as HMS Corncrake. Was a naval station and an RAF station from the early 1940s until it closed in 1947. And I have always had a great interest in all things to do with the RAF here in the Ards Peninsula. And my story sort of starts here, and why I'm here is in the summer of 2004, I was on holiday with my family, my wife and two small children, sitting in a general seating area in Gatwick Airport. There was hundreds of people there waiting on their next flights. And I just happened to sit beside an elderly gentleman and his wife. And I turned momentarily to him to apologise for my children. They weren't misbehaving, they never do. They were just a wee bit boisterous, having been on a plane from Belfast and having the pain and discomfort of having to sit idly by and wait for a few hours. And I spoke to this gentleman and we had a brief conversation about the usual things, how busy the airport was and all the rest of it. And then I happened to say to him, "Can you understand me okay? Does my accent throw you in any way?" No, he says, "I understand you perfectly." I says, "Great." I says, "I come from Northern Ireland." He says, "I know that." I says, "Okay." I says, "And where do you come from?" He says, "I come from Vancouver, and my wife and I were flying home." And all about how he was flying home to Vancouver. And then he said to me, he said, "Whereabouts in Northern Ireland do you come from?" I says, "I come from a place called Kirkcubbin." "Oh," he says, "Kirkcubbin." He says, "I know Kirkcubbin well." He says, "Is the Mermaid still open?" And this sort of took me with a wee bit of a surprise, because it was unusual for someone from so far away to actually know anything about Kirkcubbin. And then he said to me, something which absolutely stunned me. He says, "I was stationed at RAF Ballyhalbert during World War II." And that really that pricked up my ears, and I thought, gosh, this man needs to be good conversation needs to be had with this man. And so we embarked on a great conversation. He told me, we sat and talked for over an hour, in fact probably even 2 hours. It certainly made the wait that we had at Gatwick a lot more pleasant. And it turned out that this man had been a fighter pilot in training. He was a member of the Royal Canadian Navy, and very sadly we never really introduced ourselves. I never really got to know his name, and he may have told me his name, but sadly I've forgotten. And his story was very, very interesting, because the Royal Canadian Navy per se were never actually among the units that were stationed here at RAF Ballyhalbert. In fact, individual Canadian airmen from the Royal Canadian Air Force were stationed at Ballyhalbert, but very few Canadian naval personnel. And this man went into great detail about his sorties and where he flew from and to, and he almost seemed to go back those 60 years back to 1944 when he was here. And he was here as part of the training for the Royal Canadian Navy to train for D-Day and operations on their beaches at Juno Beach in Normandy. So going back to what he told me about the day in the life almost of a fighter pilot at RAF Ballyhalbert in training. And one of their training missions, he told me, was they did the same thing almost every day for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. And the mission was, on average, of taking off here from RAF Ballyhalbert, heading out over the top of Kirkcubbin into the middle of Strangford Lough, banking right over the islands, the Portree Islands, heading up towards Scrabatar. Scrabatar was their marker point. Over the course of this route, he had a few marker points. The first marker point for him that he told me about was Scrabatar. Now, he didn't call it Scrabatar, because I noticed when I was talking to this man, the names of the places he didn't know. He described them to me, and I was able to then say, right, well, a big hill near RAF Newtownards with a monument on top. Yes, he said, that's what it was. And I said, well, that's called Scrabba Tower. And whether it actually resonated with him, the names or not, I've no idea. But he described perfectly his marker points. So the first marker point, Scrabba Tower. Then the next, flying over Craigantlet, the next point he would be looking for was what he described to me as a lighthouse on a harbour. Well, of course, there could only be one, and that's Donaghadee. So he said we flew over, heading for the lighthouse on the harbour, the end of the harbour, and he said there was wee islands on the other side, and I said, well, that's called the Copeland Islands. So he said, well, he says, so we would have fly then between the lighthouse and the Copeland Islands, flying on down. We changed course to a southerly direction, and he said the next waypoint for me was another lighthouse, only this one was an old abandoned one sitting in the middle of the sea. And I said, that sounds to me like the South Rock Lighthouse. And he says, well, he says, if that's what you want to call it, that's fair enough. He says, it was just an abandoned lighthouse in the sea. And he says, we flew down there, and it said once we got past that old lighthouse, that was when, he says, really, that was when it was game on. That was when we needed to start thinking, because we dropped down to sea level. And when I say sea level, I mean they're flying below radar, so they're trying to aim at an average of between 50 and 75 feet above the sea. And he says, one of the main factors in this is avoiding other aircraft. He says, because we could also be in the path, because we were passing RAF Ballyhalbert. We could also have been in the path of aircraft coming into land at Ballyhalbert. We were also in the path of Kirkcubbin, which was the satellite station for RAF Ballyhalbert.
As a young boy, I was reared over there just on the other side of where the plastic would be. And I can remember hearing a plane coming in from like Portavogie. That would be southeasterly from where I am. And I heard the noise. I knew it was quite low. Ran up the yard, and the plane was flying about 12 foot in the air. It was a Spitfire. I can remember the red, white and blue circles on her, and the pilot waved out. He had a leather helmet, goggles, and he waved out, and I, as a boy, waved back. So he came on down, swung right out onto the sea at the Castle Hill, and headed for the target practice at Grange Point, which is out here. As you see today, it's a beautiful view.
And he said we were mindful of other aircraft in the air always. But then once he passed the South Rock, that was when their mission really started. And their mission was very simple. They were going to engage targets on land. So it was an air-to-ground assault at low level. And they needed to turn and they needed to head towards the Narrows. And once they headed down towards the Narrows, they would sweep in to the right at very low level in between the two towns there, which he just referred to as the two wee villages. And he would head down in, and then he said to me, there's an island with a hump on it. And of course, we know that as Donaghadee Island. And he said we would sweep round and aim for the island with a hump. But obviously, he said we couldn't come too close to it because we were at that level. So whatever size above the water Donaghadee is, that must have been the altitude that they were flying at. and their targets were then strung out along what we know as Grantia Point, probably at low water along the Long Sheila, and that area of dry land that there is there at low tide. And they then commenced to strafe that, and they do their strafing runs with their machine guns and their cannons, and they would go around a couple of times, strafe the same targets, and then they would exit, fly away. Strafing the targets at Grantia Point would have been the primary target, and then there may have been other targets there in Strangford Lough at Grey Abbey, along the islands at Grey Abbey. They would have attacked those as well, and then taken off again, mindful of the time that they had in the air over Normandy, I suppose, mindful of what targets would present themselves to the fighters as they were flying overhead Normandy, and always, of course, looking out for Messerschmitts and looking out for the German aircraft. All of this may have played a part in their training over Strangford Lough, and then they would bank out, once they'd finished, bank out towards Malyle, come back round, and coming here from the Scottish coast, flying east to west over the runway here and landing here from that direction of Scotland. Part of our conversation turned to Kirkcubbin, and one of his first questions to me was the mermaid still there? And I had to laugh at that, because obviously a bit of R&R played a lot of time in their minds, and where there were young men that were out for a night out, and I happened to say to him, "Did you have a night out or two in the Mermaid?" He says, "Oh gosh, aye." He says, we had plenty of nights out in the Mermaid. And I said, "Well, what sort of a night did you have?" "Oh," he says, "we had a great night." He says, "We would get the bicycles down." He says, "We would take bicycles." And I always wondered, when he said take bicycles, did he mean they were borrowing them, or were they stealing them, or were they whatever they were doing with these bicycles? And they would ride the bikes to Kirkcubbin, abandon them somewhere in Kirkcubbin, go into the Mermaid and have a few drinks and enjoy themselves. And then I don't know how they got home. I think the way he was talking, he didn't know how he got home either, but he managed to make it to Ballyhalbert all right. And one of his, I think the reason he was so enjoying his conversation was because I also had a few drinks in the Mermaid from time to time many years ago. And there was that sort of commonality that we both shared, and I thought it was very amusing, his story. And he told me also about the army truck would take them to and from the Mermaid, and obviously it was a common spot for the RAF crews, and he was Royal Canadian Navy. He told me there was New Zealanders there was Australians, there was English, Scotch, Welsh, Irish, Rhodesians, South Africans. He said everybody you could think of was here. Everybody was in Ballyhalbert, every nationality you could think of, and of course the Polish and the Czechs as well. Although he specifically didn't mention those men, but they were certainly here, and I'm sure they all enjoyed a wee pint in Kirkcubbin. And all in all, I was absolutely enthralled by this. My brief description here doesn't even come close to those 2 hours. It was like a 10-year-old myself sitting at the cinema waiting for the best film in the world to come on. I was so enjoying this man's conversation. And of course then at the end of it we're called for our flight. He's called for his flight. We shake hands. He said to me, he says, "That's brought back a lot of memories." He said, "I really enjoyed speaking to you." And I says, "You have no idea how much I have the absolute privilege to talk to you." And well, that was it. We shook hands, off we went. Him to Vancouver, and my wife and children and I to New York.